I don't know. Maybe the Mesa will sound better through the T75s. Guess we gotta rewire everything. Hey, man bun! Have you decided which amp and cabinet you want to use? It's a tough decision, bro. The saturation on the JP2C sounds killer, but that raw tone on the DSL100 just melts your face off. And the Shiva model on the Kemper is ridiculous. Don't even get me started on which cabinet to use. The vintage 30s or the T75s. I wish being a cameraman for a low-budget YouTube channel paid more so I could afford more studio time. Don't worry, man. I got you covered with this amp and cab switcher from KHE Audio. We can instantly switch between any amp or cab you want. Holy shit, man. That's fucking awesome. Dude, language. What is up, everyone? Man Bun Melod here. Today, we're going to take a close look at the ACX 4x4 FX from KHE Audio Electronics. This is an amp and cabinet switcher with amp effects loop switching as well. Before we get into it, I should note that KHE sent me this unit, but that will in no way affect my review. KHE offers 7 different models depending on what you need. I specifically asked for this model because it does everything I want it to do. It can switch between 4 different amps, including effects loops, and 4 different cabinets. With the other models, you can set up as little as 4 amplifiers and 2 cabinets with no effects loop switching, to as much as 8 amplifiers and 8 cabinets by linking the ASX8 and CSX8 together. Add in the AFX8 and you have 8 channels of effects loop switching as well. All these units have sophisticated signal monitoring, so you don't have to worry about frying your expensive tube amps. It's capable of handling 150 watts and has a maximum switching time of 15 milliseconds. This unit also has a switchable attenuator insert, MIDI control, link mode to link multiple units together, dual cab mode, a tuner output, and ground lift switch. You can see what features the other models have in this table. This unit sells for 1,099 Swiss francs, which is about 1,225 USD at the time of this video. They are a Swiss-based company, but offer shipping within 24 hours. The response times to my questions have been quick and informative. I might be receiving special treatment because they want me to do the video, but I'd expect them to treat everyone the same. Comment below if you have experience with their customer service. Aside from the unit, it comes with a power supply brick and manual. The manual is so well put together and descriptive, I was up and running in no time. As you see B-roll shots of the switcher, you may notice the left rack ear is a little dinged up. This is completely my fault. I stupidly moved a cabinet that was connected to the unit and it dropped about 3 feet onto a thin rug, which was over a concrete floor. Fortunately, other than the rack ear, the only thing that was damaged was my ego. Taking a closer look at the build of the switcher, it fits into a 19-inch 1U rack chassis and is about 7.1 inches or 180 millimeters deep from the front plate to the back. On the front of the unit, there's the guitar input, 4 amp switches with accompanying LEDs, an effects loop button and LED, 4 cabinet switches and LEDs, a control button and LED, and finally the power button. On the back of the unit is the power input, MIDI input, control input and output for linking multiple switchers together, then the 4 cabinet outputs, S-line send and return, typically used for the power attenuator, the amp inputs and amp outputs, a second guitar input and tuner output, finally 4 sets of effects loop sends and returns which go to the amps, and the effects input and output, which would go to the effects you want in the effects loop. The build quality of this guy is top notch. The case is solid, there is no play in the 1/4-inch jacks, they are spaced far enough apart that you can fit larger plug housings next to each other. I like how the cabinet jacks are red and the amp outputs are blue, making the connection process a little more foolproof. The switches have a nice tactical feel, and the internal relays have a very satisfying sound when they switch. Overall, I'm very impressed with how this unit is built. Now looking at my setup, I have 3 amps connected, a Marshall DSL100, Mesa Boogie JP2C, and Kemper Power Rack Profiler. I've set the Kemper to a Bogner Shiva profile. Since this is a metal channel, I've set all the amps to a distorted channel. For cabinets, I have my Marshall 1968 4x12 loaded with Celestion G12T75s and a custom 2x12 cabinet loaded with Celestion Vintage 30s. Each is mic'd with an SM57. I'm using the effects loop on all 3 amps. In front of the amps, I'll have a Tube Screamer clone, and in the effects loop, a Decimator 2 G-string noise suppressor, timeline delay, and GT1000 core, which I'll be using for EQ and reverb. I won't go into all the setup, but it's not difficult. Just follow the instructions in the manual. One tip I'd have though is to use different color connectors for your amp outputs and cabinet inputs. That way when you have a bunch of cables connected to the back of the unit, you know for sure which is supposed to go to an amp and which is supposed to go to a cabinet. I'd also recommend connecting your cabinets first, as this is simple, then connecting the effects you want in the effects loop to the effects send and return, and your guitar with the pre-effects to the front or back of the guitar. The front input has priority over the back. Once you have all that connected, I connect one amp at a time, input, effects loop, and output, and test it before continuing to the next amp. In my opinion, it helps in preventing crossing cables. A couple of cautions when making your connections: make sure your amps are off when making or breaking any connections. There's a chance you'll activate the warning tone and put the unit into safe mode. I'm not speaking from experience. Also, make sure your amp output and speaker input impedances match. This is very important for tube amps. If you have 16 ohm cabinets like I do, use the 16 ohm outputs on your amps. There are a few settings you can toggle in the setup menu. To access it, just hold down the control button until it blinks. This is the first setup menu. Here you can activate recall mode, dual cab mode, ground lift, or the attenuator insert. In recall mode, when the unit is switched on, it will recall whatever amp and cabinets were switched on when the power was last turned off. Otherwise, nothing will be activated when the unit is turned on. In dual cab mode, you can activate 2 cabinets at once. I'll demo this later in the video. The ground lift is useful if you have an audible ground loop, and the amp attenuator insert is used to, as you might have guessed, activate an attenuator connected to the S-line send and return. I'll be using a Tone King Iron Man 2 for this testing, so I can have some good tones and not blow out my eardrums. If there is no attenuator connected, you cannot activate the loop. Hitting the control button one more time will get you into the MIDI setup menu. Here you can select the MIDI channel shown as binary code with the 4 amp LEDs. Don't worry, there's a reference table in the manual. Now we're ready to start testing some amps and cabs. Right now the unit is turned on, but nothing is activated. You can see 2 of the cabinet switches are dimly lit. That means it detects that a cabinet is connected to that channel. If I activate one of those switches, the light brightens up. If I switch to the other cabinet, it automatically turns off the first cabinet. It will not let me activate a cabinet if nothing's connected. When you have a cabinet selected, you can select an amp and go back and forth between amps. You can even select an amp channel that doesn't have an amp connected. You can turn on the effects loop for the selected channel by pressing the effects button, and you'll see the effects LED light up. This setting is linked to the amp channel, so if I switch amps, this effects loop is turned off, and if I go back to the previous amp, the effects loop is on. If you happen to turn off the active cabinet channel, it will turn off any amp channel that's currently active. I was a little skeptical of how well this switcher will protect my tube amps. After all, you're never supposed to turn on a tube amp without a load connected. I asked a question to KHE, and they came back with this reply. All not activated amps are protected by a resistive load inside the KHE. The KHE also hard mutes the guitar inputs of the unused amp, so there is no output signal from the amp present at the load resistors. The KHE constantly supervises the load resistors and warns you with a loud acoustic buzzer in case of an accidental overload of the resistors to prevent damage. Knowing this and having experienced warnings when I was doing things I shouldn't have, I'm very confident my amps aren't going to blow up. Now let's see how this works while live switching between amps and cabs. Because I can't physically switch it while playing, I've set up a MIDI program in Reaper to automatically do the switching for me. The MIDI capability on this is nice. In 50 seconds, I just tested 6 different setups. You can definitely hear a gap in audio when it switches. When switching cabinets, the switching time was about 40 milliseconds, and when switching amps, about 120 milliseconds. I was switching the FX loops on here as well. When I turned the FX loop off, the switching time decreased to 90 milliseconds. When switching the amp and cabinet at the same time, the switching time was about 180 milliseconds. Looking at the waveforms, it looks like it switches the amp first, then the cab. The switching can be obvious, but unless you're using this in a live scenario, it's probably not a huge deal. Now let's try dual cab mode. I'll go into control mode and hit the second switch to turn on dual cab mode. I'm also going to disengage the amp attenuator circuit since the Tone King has impedance switches on the back, and if I'm using both cabs, that'll be 8 ohms. Now we'll turn off control mode and start off with cabinet 1 and use the Kemper since I don't need to match impedances with a solid state amplifier. I'll also turn down the Kemper just a little bit to adjust for the lack of attenuator. Overall, this unit does a great job at what it's supposed to. It's packed full of features and the build quality is fantastic. Of course, I have to try to find some faults, and you may not be surprised, it is hard to come up with a few. The first thing that I found out by absolute coincidence was that if you have a cabinet selected, then unplug that cabinet either at the cabinet or at the switcher, it will not deactivate the cabinet channel. While this could be a huge issue if you unplug the cabinet while you're playing through it, you run the same risk with a direct connection. So just be careful and don't mess around with the connections if anything is playing through it. All the channels on the ACS should be switched off as well as the amplifiers when changing any connections. Secondly, I like to see a MIDI through connector. It's not a huge deal, but with as much as I use MIDI, I like to have the option to pass that signal onto another device if I needed to. Not a huge deal, but it would be a nice to have. While we're on the subject of MIDI, controlling each switch with a control change command is easy to set up, but you can only send a signal to flip the switch. I like to be able to send 2 commands, one to turn the switch on and one to turn it off. If you have a sequence set up and you start from the beginning, it doesn't know what it's already on. You can work around this by sending a signal to turn everything off at the beginning of the sequence so you start off with a clean slate. But I wouldn't mind having the extra flexibility with on and off commands. If you're looking for an amp and cab switcher, I would highly recommend one of these. They can save you a lot of time in the studio and could even be useful on stage if you have to use multiple amps, as long as you're okay with the switching delay. But hey, until next time, rock on.